Hi, this is Kanaya, and today I'm going to read Martin Luther King, The Peaceful Warrior. This is written by Ed Clayton, illustrated by Dave Hodges. So you can get this book from Amazon, or you can get this book from Amazon, and you can get this book from the library if they do have it. So let's take a look at the back of the book and see. So it says, a man with a dream. When he was a young man, Martin Luther King wanted a career helping people. He felt that as a minister, he could speak out against racial injustice. Follow the example of the Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi. Dr. King chose nonviolence as the keystone of his fight for civil rights. Dr. King became a leader of the civil rights movement in 1955. He helped to organize the famous Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, freedom rides, sit-ins, and protest marches. Straightened the battle against discrimination. As a result of these, in 1964, the United States Congress passed the historic Civil Rights Bill. Dr. King received word exclaim when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Congress had recently established national holiday commemorating the birthday of this great man who courageously led a peaceful struggle for equal rights for all Americans. This, the author is well informed, and he skillfully and imaginatively blends factual information into an inspiring story for young readers. So let's see if we can flip this one over. Let's see if we can flip this over. And I'm going to explain as I read the story. So let's see. So it says, a new sense of purpose. With unusual fervor and spiritual outpouring, the huge crowd lifted its voice in an opening hymn. With one mighty voice came the words, "Onward, Christian shoulders." Then Dr. King rose to speak, and the crowd was silent. The television cameras began to roll. The Montgomery bus boycott had become news. Love must be a regulating ideal. Dr. King stressed in his clear, strong voice, if you will protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, and when the history books are written in future generation, the historians will have to pause and say, they lived a great people of black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. This is our challenging and our overwhelming responsibility. Let's see. The hard way up. Someday, whispered Martin Luther King Jr. to his mother as they sat together in church listening to a guest speaker. I'm going to have me some big words like that. Miss Alberta King looked at her 11-year-old son with quiet gentleness and pride. I'm sure you will, son, she whispered back. And to herself she thought it it would be a lot easier for him to come by his big words than it was for his father before him. So his mother and his son was at a church, and And they was like, oh, one day I'm gonna have some big words like that. So she knew that if Jan Martin were called to work, he would very likely follow his father as pastors of Ebenezer Baptist Church. But her husband, Martin Sir, had not had a ready-made berth to step into. He had fought for his place in the world with sweat and raw determination. Mrs. King mused on, only half hearing the rich voices of the choir. His father, the Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, had served as the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church for 37 years. He had practically belted up from the ground. Monsieur had taken over as the packager when his father-in-law had died. So he was, so years ago, so, so he was the black minister and civil rights activist. So from Jean Country, Georgia. So he was the grandson of a slave preacher. Willis and his wife, Lucreta, Lucreta Williams, So he celebrated his birthday the day after the effective date of the Emancipation Proclamation. So he spent his childhood on the Williams plant. He had taken many giant steps first. So he spent his time. Let's see this. So that's what he did back then. So he belted up from the. So he was born on a rundown farm in Stockbridge, Georgia, at the turn of the century, December 19th, 1899. Long before he had even seen the inside of a schoolhouse, he was at work in the fields with his 10 brothers and sisters, helping to plant and harvest their meager crops of cotton and corn. So, so when Martin was a kid, he helped. So when after all of this happened, so this happened way back then, when when they when they all had to help crop and plant in the fields and crop the and corn, cotton and corn. So when so until Martin Sir was 15, until Martin Sir was 15, he never had more than 3 months of schooling in any one year. Even on school days, Martin Sir had his chores. He was at dawn to curry or brush down the family's 2 meals. His schoolmates often teased him because they said that he even smelled like a mule. So when Dr. King went to school, they was they was bullying him and saying he was smelling like a mule. So I may smell like a mule, he once snapped back, but I don't think like one. So Martin Sir's bus subject was always arithmetic. Somehow it made the most sense to him and had more to do with his daily life than any of his other subjects. He often gave himself examples to work out that were not to be found in his textbooks. He would set problems like this to figure out. Most of us except Mama work in the fields all day, every day but Sunday. So they will go out work in the fields every day except for Sundays. So that's usually 12 of us. Now, if you took all those hours and multiplied them by the 12 of us, it would it would turn out a lot of hours. So the boss, he continued to himself, referring to the white man who owned their farm. Don't work half that time yet. He gets half of what 12 of us earns. That just don't make sense as arithmetic. That just don't make sense as arithmetic, he muttered to himself. Mine's arithmetic. Stand the stand still. Mine's ar- arithmetic stood the King family in good stead at harvest time one year. The boss was doing the figuring out on the king's crop. Martin's father, James Albert King, was standing passively by. Dr. King could barely read and write, and he was very respectful of the boss' knowledge of figures. When the boss had finished, he turned to Martin's father with a grin. Well, we're all even, he said. When the boss meant by even was that Mr. King's share of his cotton crop would be just enough to pay for the food and other supplies that the king had bought for the credit at the boss store during the past winter. Being even also meant that Mr. King would receive no cash for the long months of labor that he and his family had put into the crop, and there would be no hope of his receiving any cash for a whole year until the next harvest. But Dr. King knew that as surely as night follows day, he would be in debit again at the boss store when he settled up the next year. It seemed that no matter how hard all of them worked, they never got ahead. So, but this year it was to be different. Young Martin had been quietly observing the boss figure in an eagle eye. He did not quite have the courage to address a white man directly, but he said to his father, "Papa, the boss forgot to add in over 7.5 stacks of seeds, and that amount to almost $1,000. Even $1,000 seemed like a fortune to the kings." Martin smiled to himself. With all that money he could see the whole family going to church. So, so imagine not getting paid the whole year. So, so afterwards, after they out cropping, and so church dress and finest. And wouldn't Mama be proud and pleased? But the boss was not proud, was not pleased. The boss had forgotten the seeds. He had merely conveniently overlooked it. Just so you remember, he threatened Martin, I don't stand for no troublemakers. If you get uppity and forgot your place, I'm going to run you off my land. You hear? Martin heard, but he wasn't satisfied with what he heard. He was still working on his own counter-arithmetic. How come, he wondered. We all work all these, we are, he wondered, we work all those hours and we live in a rundown, leaky old shack. And the boss workers less and he lives in a big fine house. Why is that we always wind up with just about nothing? So a week of backbreaking work work for a few hours of forgetfulness and strong strength was a good way of life. It was his father's way. It was not Martin's way. So let's see. Why is it that we always wind up with just about nothing? When Martin was 15, he left the farm for good and went to Atlanta, 20 miles away, to find work. He could no longer stand the dragging, sad round of defeat and despair. He did not think that a week of backbreaking work for a few hours of for forgetfulness and strong thing was a good way of life. It was his father's way, but it was not Martin's. So they went to Atlanta because Martin couldn't afford to do another week of backbreakings. So Martin was sure that more schooling would help him make a better life for himself, and that's what he set out to get. That's what he set out. He set out to get. Of course, he had work during the day to support himself, but to support himself. Listen. So Martin was sure that more schooling would help him make a better life for himself, and that's what he set out to get. Of course, he had to work during the day to support himself, and the only jobs open to Negroes in those days were the hard jobs. He hauled to freight in a railroad yard and learned to stroke an engine. He was still a growing boy, and he pushed himself straight strength to the utmost and beyond every working day. The meals that he could afford didn't give him much to grow on either. So let's see. So he hauled so don't you supposed to say didn't he? So he hauled freight in a railroad yard and learned how to stroke an engine. He was still a growing boy, and he pushed his strength to the utmost and beyond every working day. The meals that he could afford didn't give him much to grow on either. At night, he got cleaned up and put on his one neat dark suit and went to school. Sometimes he could hardly stay awake in class. Many times he was so discouraged that he was almost ready to quit, but he didn't. It took Martin Luther King, Sr. 11 long years to work his way through high school, and he was 26 years old when he got his diploma. 5 years later, when he graduated from Morehouse College, he was already a minister, a husband, and a father. Having married Albert William when he was still in school, their first child, Willie Christine, was born in Godfather Williams Baxter's 12-room house in Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. The Reverend King had come a long way from the rundown from which he was born. So when Dr. King was 26 years old, he got his diploma and he graduated the Morehouse College 5 years later. So, so, so we know that Albert and his husband got married while Dr. King was in school. So he worked. So now he went from. He went from little. He went from his rundown, and he worked his way up. So that's why he pushed himself to do something that he so he so he worked his way up from his rundown. So now it says the ghetto and the church. Martin Luther King was the middle child in his family. He was born on January 15th, 1929, a year after his sister Chris, and a year before his mother, who had been christened Fred Daniel. All the King children was born in their grandfather William's house. In those days, there were not even the hope that a Negro might choose the neighborhood where he wanted to live. In cities and towns over the United States, Negroes could only live in the colored section, and this was much like living in a ghetto. Those walled cities within cities into which the Jews were herded in Europe. Most of the King's neighborhoods on Auburn Avenue and a few adjacent streets that made up the Atlantic Ghetto had only one thing in common. They were all Negroes. Some of them were uneducated field hands. When they came to Atlanta, they got manual jobs only as janitors or garbage men. Some of them could not find steady work, so that means they couldn't find a good job. They couldn't find jobs that would and that they would be interested in. They only had to work. They can go. They only could get manual jobs as janitors or garbage men. That was the two choices that they can choose from, and some of them were uneducated field hands. They couldn't get education. They couldn't, so they didn't learn anything. They only had to work out in the fields for hours and hours. So, so those who those who had never been taught a trade worked as day laborers when there were buildings to be built or ditches to be dug. When there was no work to be done, their families were hungry. They couldn't get any food, but they had to dig the ditches, build the buildings. As some of the women were luckier than the men, they had to be trained as house servants. They could always find jobs as cooks and maids in Atlanta's many prosperous and prosperous white home. Often, the mother of Negro family was able to earn more as a servant than her husband could earn as an unskilled laborer. These homes were restless and unhappy. Men like to provide for their families, not to leave it up to their women's folk. But there were a few who prospered at the ghetto, and the ghetto too. There were a handful of college graduates. Most of them had entered the profession, being among the first Negro teachers, lawyers, doctors, and dentists. Like Martin's father, they had been strong enough to work their way up against terrible odds, and everyone in the neighborhood was proud of them. There were even some Negro-owned business in Urban Avenue, I think, two insurance companies, and a drugstore that grew a chain of 5 drugstores throughout the city. In fact, there was a Negro who was almost a millionaire on Urban Avenue. The heart of the Atlanta ghetto was centered in its churches. There were 3 of them within 6 blocks on Urban Avenue. Ebenezer Baptist Church was Martin's family's church. His grandfather served as passenger for passenger there for 37 years. Martin was 2 when his grandfather died at 68, preparing his Sunday sermon, but the church remained in the family with Martin's family was Martin's father taking over as passengers. At the time that Martin was growing up, the church was his second home. Through it, he felt the heartbeat of his neighborhood. He heard his father preach a new way of life to his neighbors. The fairly young pastor, pastor begged his people to hold their hands high and not to take abuse from anyone, but always to walk humbly with your God. When their steps faltered and they were in need, Martin watched his mother and his grandmother pack baskets of food for them. He grew with the Bible and words of Chris as living things. He knew early what it meant to his neighborhoods to turn the other cheek, and what it cost them to love their enemies or to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. By the time Martin was 4, his clear young voice was heard singing solos on Sunday mornings at Ebenezer. Soon, other Negro congregations wanted to hear him too, and his mother often took him to smaller churches in nearby towns to sing. So his mother, so Martin was, so he sung at smaller churches. So his mother took him to other churches to sing, and the tiny boy with his true rich voice moved his hero deeply. In the small towns where people had not yet learned quiet city ways, the end of Martin's hymn was always great fervent amens and praise the Lord. Many a small church almost rocked with joy after Martin sang. People clapped and got the spirit, and sometimes Martin felt almost frightened by the noise. Were much quieter as Ebenezer. So you see, the people were singing, but I'm sure. So at least, so you see, this is a group of people singing, but so when he was 4, his mother used to take him to other church so he can sing, and people usually clap for him sing. So he was frightened by the noise. So So the people in the small town churches showed their appreciation of Martin in another way too. Often when he sang the thank offering or collection was a big one. And yet, as Martin was, he knew this was a good thing. Maybe some of the money would be added to the fund for a new church roof. Or perhaps there would be children wearing new clothes when they started school. When they started school, children who might have gone in rags if Martin had not sung. So school days, when Martin's big sister Chris turned 6 and started school, 5-year-old Martin insisted that he was grown up enough when he was grown enough to go too, but he was so passionate in his pleas pleas that he would finally convince his mother to take him along. Martin's mother was a school teacher and she recognized that her son was an ex- that he was an exceptionally bright child. So she decided to enroll him in the first grade, hoping that he could pass as a 6-year-old. But Martin didn't remain in school long. But soon after he started, the he let the secret of his real age slip out. He was telling the other children in his class about his most recent birthday party. So his mother decided to get him into sixth grade, and his mother was a school teacher, and he told the other children in his class about his birthday party, his most recent birthday party. And there were 5 candles on my cake, he said proudly. His teacher overheard him, and that was the end of Martin's schooling until the following year. But he hasn't been in school long before he was skipped into his sister Chris' grade. So Dr. King, he hasn't been in school very long. So soon after Martin started school, he began to spell out the signs in his neighborhood and around the city. One of the first things he learned to read was for whites only. He seldom rode in streetcars or buses because his mother or father usually drove him in a family car, but when he did, there was still more signs to read. There was color seat from the rear and color exit by rear door. Little by little, he was becoming more aware of what it meant to be a Negro living in a deep South. It was around this time that Martin began to notice a few rather special things about his father, the Reverend King. So when he was in school, he learned to read signs. He had to read. He learned to read signs for whites only. He had to learn. Oh, so one day, as he and his father was driving downtown, they were stopped by a policeman. "Let's see your license, boy." The crowd drove to Martin's father. Like most Southerners, the policeman addressed all Negro men, even venerable old men with the belittling boy. The Reverend King reached for his license, but before he handed it to the policeman, he said, pointing to Martin, "He's a boy, and I'm a man." Another time, his father took Martin downtown to buy him a pair of shoes. The white clerk came busting over. He was courteous but firm. I'll be glad to serve you. If you see no seats at the back of the store," he said, Nothing wrong with it's not. He said, nothing wrong with these seats. Thank you, Reverend King answered pleasantly. The clerk was so embarrassed, but firmer. But we don't serve colored, and we don't serve colored in the front of the store. He tried to explain. If you don't serve colored in the front of the store, you don't serve these colored at all, said the Reverend King, and he took Martin by the hands and watched out. Of course, things like this don't come up every day in a week. Don't come up every day in a week. Sometimes months will go by without incident. Martin spent a lot of time climbing the big oak tree in the yard next door or sitting in the shade and reading, and sometimes he would fly a kite with his brother AD or skate on the sidewalk in front of the house with Chris. Every so often, there was a softball game in a vacant lot next door. One day, when they were playing baseball, Mon and AD were on opposite team. So Mon was catching for his team. Whenever AD turns at bat, he missed the ball, but the bat flew out of his hand and smashed into Martin, who was squatting at home plate. There was sickening thud and Martin was knocked. So it says, it's nothing wrong with these seats. Thank you, Reverend King answered pleasantly. So they didn't serve colored things in the front of the store. And so there was no so things didn't turn the way that they didn't so they couldn't serve colors at all at the store. These colors at all. And then when he was younger he played basketball with his sister. So when he was younger he played baseball with his brother AD. So AD would when AD played basketball he would miss the ball and so and flew and the bat flew out of his hand and smashed into Martin. So flat, he lay on the ground, pale and still. You okay? AD kept asking his brother. After what seemed long time, Martin sat up. Sure, I'm okay, he said to his brother, but you're not. The but you're not. That was your third strike and you're out. One of the Martin roughest childhood experiences occurred when he was 6. A white shopkeeper on Urban Avenue told her 2 sons they could no longer play with Martin because he's colored. So, so, because, so he was a black boy, but they couldn't play with him because he was a colored person. The 3 boys have been firm friends, and Martin did not forget this. 5 years later, he was aboard. He 5 years later, he still bore a deep scar from the incident. And one day, while shopping downtown with his mother, Martin had another bad experience. Martin had another bad experience. Usually, Martin liked to go shopping. He liked the hustle and bustle, and he especially liked seeing the toys and fine clothes in a downtown store. Suddenly, a white woman popped out of the crowd of shoppers She planted herself directly in front of Martin and said the hate-filled word, the hate-filled word that Martin always dreaded. "You little nigger who stepped on my foot," she bellowed, and before Martin could answer her, she lifted her hand and slapped his face hard. Then she disappeared into the crowd again. Like so many of his people before him, Martin was taught about prudence the hard way. He had looked the word up in his dictionary and found that it came from two Latin words, "pu" before and the and a judicum judgment. The definition said that produce was an opinion form without just grounds. The white lady, Martin told his mother, certainly formed her opinion of me without just grounds. So, think before you act. Think before you act. Martin was still small for his age, and the big bullies looked upon him as a safe target. He soon found out that fighting back would get him nowhere. Still, he was not a coward and refused to run when he was challenged. So he learned to stand up for his rights by talking his way out of trouble. Even AD, when he was a year younger, was a shade taller and more robust than his brother, and this ranked Martin one day. AD was teasing Chris as she begged him to stop, and so he did, Martin, but AD kept reaching on, but AD kept right on teasing him. Finally, Chris burst into tears. Without thinking, Martin picked up the telephone receiver and clout AD on the head. AD went out like a light and did not come until 7 obnoxious moments had passed. AD developed on an egg-sized bump on his head, of which he was very proud. Martin did not think to himself for days afterwards because he had struck his brother. Fairly, often Martin seemed compelled to do things without thinking. Usually they were the kind of things that you got him into trouble and made him feel guilty. So Martin and AD shared a bike, and Martin used to make his brother angry by taking long turns with it. Sometimes he would disappear for a whole afternoon, and AD didn't think it was fair. AD didn't think this was fair. The boys had been forbidden to ride anywhere but on the sidewalk, and so AD and Martin didn't get along together. So Martin had to take long turns and and struck his brother, and Martin just used to do things without thinking. So and they had been cautioned to stay in their own neighborhood, but Martin just had to see what other neighborhoods looked like. One spring day, Martin took a friend for a ride on the handlebars of his bike. They headed downtown to see what they could see. When they got into the crowded downtown section, Martin had a hard time dodging in and out among the of the Prestons. He edged he edged his bike off the sidewalk and into let's see into the traffic. Before he had gone a block, he was sideswiped by a truck. He and his rider were thrown from the bike, and the next thing Martin knew, a neighbor was bending over him. The boys in the mingled bite were brought home by the neighbor, who had been driving by when the accident occurred. Boys were lightly shaken up, and the black and blue are over. But worst of all, Martin had to face AD, who was pretty cross about the condition of their bike. I've got to think things out better before I go ahead and do them, Martin told himself. Actually, Martin was always upset when he did anything that hurt anyone, particularly a member of his family. He was especially devoted to his mother, who he always called Mother Dear, and to his grandmother, Miss Jeannie Williams, who he called Mama. Often on Saturday nights, Martin's mother stayed up late to cook the family's Sunday dinner so that she could go to church with them the next day. Martin liked to stay up to help her. He would fire the furnace or carry up the garbage or maybe peel potatoes. Sometimes he would just sit and talk to his mother to keep her company while she worked. His grandmother was a pleasant-faced, cheerful woman, and Martin enjoyed being around people who were pleasant and had kind words to say. When Martin's mother or father spanked him for disobedience, Mama's mother's kind words would help to heal his hurt. So, Martin was Mrs. Williams' favorite grandchild, and she made no attempt to hide it. The two of them were very close. On Sunday, when Martin was 12, the family had gone to church together as usual. After the service, Miss Williams had left them to go to another church where she has to be the guest speaker at a Women's Day program. The rest of the family went home to dinner except Martin. He sneaked off and headed downtown to see the parade and an activity which was strictly forbidden on Lord's Day. As Martin so let's see. So as Martin stood watching the parade, he saw a friend push his way through the crowd to reach him. The boy had been sent by the family. In a breathless rush of words, he told Martin that his grandmother was dead. So Mrs. Williams had suffered a heart attack at the church where she was to speak. Where she has was where she was to speak. She had been rushed to the hospital but had died before reaching it. Martin felt that the judgment of God has been visited upon him because he had gone to a forbidden parade. He felt responsible for his grandmother's death. When he got home, the family had already gathered to a more, and the house was filled with neighbors and church members who had come to consort them. Martin's eyes darted from one face to another. Reddened eyes stared back at him. Accusingly, he thought. He looked for his mother, in whose face he hoped to find forgiveness. Finally, his eyes met hers. Without saying a word, she buried her face in a handkerchief and wept. Martin did not know what to do. If he had If only he hadn't gone to the parade, he stumbled up the stairs, and he knew only that he wanted to escape their accusing eyes. He had no plan when he threw open the rear window on the second floor. For For a moment he looked down at the peaceful green quiet of the garden. Then he jumped. When Martin picked himself up a few minutes later, he discovered that his bruises were minor. Praise the Lord, he whispered. The praise reminded him of something way back in his experience. Yes, he had it. The small churches where he sang as a boy, he remembered the swelling, praise the Lord, and the amen and the shouting that he had frightened him. And it was the lack of control that made him afraid him. And it was his own lack of control that he was facing now. For a long while Martin sat on the grass, nursing his bruises and thinking very hard. During the sad hours of his grandmother burial, Martin's contained his grief with quiet control. People said that he had grown up overnight. So the dream begins. The dream begins. Okay, so let's see. So the dream. Oh, so the dream begins. The Reverend King would never watch his boys to be soft, even though he was able to make their childhoods a lot easier. His has happened. He has always insisted that if they wanted to spend their money, they had better work for it. And that was more they had better to do a good job or answer to him. Martin began selling Atlanta's evening newspaper, the Atlanta Journal. As soon as he was big enough to lift the huge bundles of newspapers and get a route of his own, he proved so responsible that by the time he was 13, he had been promoted to assist manager of one of the newspaper's neighborhood dispose station. One of the things one liked best to do with the money he earned was buy books, special books he had long since found out that the history book was given in school had very little in them about Negro history, and he was determined to find out more about his own people. After Martin finished the sixth grade, his parents sent him to a private laboratory school, which he was which was being conducted as an experiment by Atlanta University. The classes were small and the students were given a great deal of individual attention by expert teachers who were eager to prove that Negro children could learn just as quickly as white children if they were given an equal opportunity. So, unfortunately, this fine school closed. Well, unfortunately, this fine school closed down for 2 years after Martin entered. So, but he learned many things that he had not even dreamed as a public school student. He learned of the giants and the heroes among his own people those who had fought for Negro freedom and whose names were seldom mentioned in American history book. He read of Harriet Tubman, the Fred Negro slaves who plotted and masterminded escape routes to the north for other runaway slaves, of the Nat Turner, an endemic Vesey who led the slaves into uprising and rebellions against their cruel plantation master. His imagination read his imagination reel when he read the Frederick Douglass and his lifelong fight to abolish slavery. Frederick Douglass, who born a slave and became a statesman. He thought often of the fact that no effective laws had been passed to help the Negro since Abraham Lincoln issued the issue the Anglopate and issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Although the Supreme Court had handed down one decision that it was not legal for white children and the Negro children to be separated or segregated in the schools. He knew that there was still segregation in most of the schools in the South. He knew that he would be proud to be like those heroes. When he was a man, in his imagination, he could see himself as Nat Turner or Demon Vesey, leading his brother to freedom in the dead of night. Or he would dream that he stood on a platform like Frederick Douglass, made further speeches about a better life for Negroes. That time had come for Martin to get the big words that he had once told his mother he would find someday, and get him he did. Martin learned how to use his big words very well. Martin learned how to use his big words very well. By the time Martin was a janitor in high school, he was using his big words so well that he was chosen, along with several other students, to represent his school and on an honorical contest in Valdosta, Georgia. Making a trip with them was their speech teacher, Miss Sarah Grace Brindley. So Martin did not win the contest, but he took the second prize for his school. So when he grew up, so on the way home, when the group boarded the bus for Atlanta, the students sat whatever seats were vacant. A short distance up the road, however, more passengers got on the bus, and most of them were white. When the white passengers not find seats, the bus driver turned around and ordered the Negroes, old and young and alike, to stand so the white passengers could sit down. Several of the older Negroes began to get up, but Martin and the other students remained in their seats. So when he grew up, so he made speeches about a better life for the Negroes. When Dr. King was in high school, he made the speech better for the Negroes, and Martin won this. So Martin took the second prize for the school, and then when they got on the bus, it was mostly like white people had to sit on the bus, and the Negroes had to stand up while when the white people had to sit on the bus. So So when the Negroes began to get up, Martin and the other students remained in their seats and annoyed the driver. This made the driver angry. He began shouting hate words at them. Still, they didn't move. Then they threatened to call the police. The students kept sitting. Uh, students. Finally, the teacher asked them to stand. At first, none of them moved. Then slowly, one by one, they stood, and they had to remain standing for most of the 90 miles back to Atlanta. Miss Bradley feebly tried to explain to the students that she felt like it was her duty to avoid trouble since she was responsible for them. They listened, but they were not convinced. Yet Martin wondered what else could she had done. Okay, what else could she had done? So the choice. At 15, at 15, at 15, Martin was ready to enter college, for he had made such giant strides at the laboratory school that he was able to skip the ninth grade and the 11th grades. When Martin entered the Morehouse College in Atlanta as a freshman in 1944, this five so giant this great Negro institution was already 65 years old. Its founder was a Negro minister, the Reverend William Jefferson White, and it was supported by both Negro and white Baptists. Its students were all Negro. So, Morehouse was respected as a school that produced great men, along its graduates so many presidents at Negro colleges, and scores of doctors, lawyers, and teachers in Morehouses had graduated. Countless ministers too along them. Martin's own father. Everyone felt certain that Martin would follow his father into the ministry. The Reverend King took it for granted, but Martin was not sure above everything else. He wanted to choose a career in which he could help his people in the best way possible. His mother sensed his indecision and suggested that Martin become a doctor. Maybe his mother was right, Martin thought. Perhaps she should become a doctor as she wished. As a doctor, he will be able to help his people to lower the high rate of disease among them. Or, what about becoming a lawyer, he wondered. As a lawyer, he would have the opportunity to use his speaking skills to help his people have their day in court. It was always like this. Whenever he tried to make up his mind about a career, he thought came to Martin. He thought came to he, the thought came to Martin that he could not commit himself until he found a work that make it possible for him to do his people the most good, even though Martin had not yet decided on a career. He chose sociology and English as C majors. Sociology would give him an understanding of the behavior of people, and English would help him become a better speaker. A good start taught something he was sure. In the end, it was an essay that helped Martin make up his mind. Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. 8 years before, in Concord, Massachusetts, Thoreau had refused to cooperate with an unjust laws. He had gone to jail for what he thought was right. So Thoreau felt that the poll tax law, which will require him to pay for the right to vote, was un- was unjust. So he did not pay his poll tax for 6 years, but insisted upon his rights to vote anyway. But wait, then he was arrested and jailed. Martin read and reread Thoreau's essay, and little by little he began to see that Thoreau's technique of civil disobedience might be used to help the Negroes gain their rights. Why not simply refuse to obey laws that upheld the abuse and mistreat of Negroes? At last, Martin had struck upon some things that might help the Negro on the road towards freedom. At through, as though of civil disobedience took root in Martin's mind, he began to realize that he would have to try to get his ideas across many Negroes if they were to succeed. Couldn't be best could, couldn't be best to come before his people as a man of God, a minister, he wondered, a new kid of minister who would lead his people to freedom. The more Martin thought about it, the more the idea of becoming a minister felt right to him. But he kept his decision to himself and prayed for guidance. He wanted to be absolutely sure that he had a vocation. By this time, Martin was nearing the end of his junior year in college, and he still had to help pay for his senior year. That summer, he joined AD and several of their friends and went to Simsbury, Connecticut to work in the tobacco fields. Martin knew that if a student was careful for what he earned, he could return home with as much as $300 or $400 to help towards his tuition. Working in Connecticut also gave Martin the chance to enjoy northern freedom. On weekends. He and AD went to town with their friends. They were free to go to any motion picture theater or to eat in any restaurant they could afford. The work, of course, was hard, picking and stripping the tobacco leaf on the seemingly endless stretches of farmland, day in and day out of the oppressive heat of the blistering sun. When Martin returned to Atlanta, his mind was made up. He let it to be known that he had been called to preach. Shortly he entered a senior class at Morehouse, 18 years old. Martin was ordained as a minister in the electric assisted pastures of Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was a jubilant day for everyone, particularly Martin's father. So, getting ready. Now it was clear to Martin where he wanted to go. His interest in religion was beginning to take on new meaning. His passion for philosophy, fired by the writing of Thoreau, led him into a constant and exciting search for other writers and philosophers. Okay, so these he believed would supply him with the additional knowledge that he needed to fight injustice. In June 1948, Martin was graduated from Morehouse College, but he did not yet feel that he had enough education to be the kind of minister be that he wanted to be. So he took advantage of the scholarship he had been awarded and decided to enter Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. Now Martin would really be on his own. This would not be like going to college at Morehouse, where he had divided his time between school and home. So this would not be like going to college at Morehouse, where he had divided his time between school and home. At Crozer, he would be living 600 miles away from home in the north and competing with white students. He began feeling a new sense of adulthood and personal responsibility. He would be the one of 6 Negroes in a student body of about 100 whites. He knew that in a sense, he would always be on an exhibit, and he was determined that no action of his would ever let his people down. Making friends always had been easy for Martin and Crozer and a friendly place, but there was one student from North Carolina who seemed unwilling to accept Negroes as his fellow students. And so in so in referring to Negroes, he often used the word darky, another insulting name which Negroes do not like. Martin did not become fully aware of how students from North Carolina felt towards Negroes. Towards ne- Martin did not become fully aware of how the student from North Carolina felt towards Negroes until he became involved in an incident with him. It grew out of a prank. Whenever a group of them found another student out of his room, they would go in and tear the room up by its roots. They appended his desk and chairs, and made such a shambles of the room that would take several hours to clean up the mess. The students from North Carolina had joined in the fun several times, but one day he returned to find that his own room had received the treatment. Immediately he went to the Martin and accused him of doing the job out of spite. Then he pulled out a gun and threatened to shoot Martin. You see that? You see what's in the picture? To shoot and turn the room. Let's see. So let's see. Then he pulled out a gun and threatened to shoot Martin. Currently, Martin then denied that he had even been in a group that had overturned the room. By now, fellow students began gathering around the two, and the students from North Carolina was persuaded to put up his gun. But the matter did not end. But the matter did not end there. It was brought before both the students' government board and the faculty. Martin refused to press charges. Finally, the white student admitted that he had been in the wrong and publicly apologized. In later years, he and Martin became very good friends. At Crozer, much of the Martin's study was devoted in the teachings of Jesus and to the writings of other great leaders of all faith. He became acquainted with the life and the teachings of the great and gentle Indian leader, Mohandas K. Gandhi, the Indian leader, the gentle Indian leader, Mohandas Khan Gandhi, the Mahatma, who had been able to free his people from British oppression with non-violent methods like Daru, Gandhi rebelled as laws which he considered unjust, but Gandhi went further than Thoreau. He taught his followers to break laws which seemed harsh and unjust, to allow themselves to be arrested, and to accept the clubbings of the police without running away or striking back. He taught love for the oppressor, not hate. Here, at last, Martin realized what Martin realized was the long-awaited method to deal with the unjust laws that kept the Negroes only half free. Why not combine the teachings and ideas of Jesus Christ? Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi, Martin asked himself, had Jesus not say, love your enemy? Did not Thoreau and Gandhi rebel against just laws? And had not Gandhi already shown that love had helped? And had not Gandhi already shown that love had helped to end per, persecution for the entire nation? Martin's mind relieved with the possibilities of such a method. It could work. He knew it could. But how? But how to get it across? Where? When? It would not be easy to bring this new idea to Negroes. He would just have to be patient and wait for the right moment. The dream unfolds. The 3 years at Crozer slipped past quickly. Living in the North most of each year gave Martin a chance to know white people who were on his side, but Martin also discovered prejudice in the North. There was no for whites only signs, but some places still did not welcome Negroes. Despite laws that said they must be served, Martin graduated from Crozer at 22. He was at the head of his class and gave valedictory address. There were also other homes, among them the Lewis Crozer Fellowship awarded of $1,200 in cash. This was to be appealed to 2 more years of study at the school of his choice. Now Martin would be able to attain the highest degree in education, a doctorate. Martin chose Boston University and rented a room in the city. He drove back and forth to school in a green Chevrolet his parents gave him as a graduation present. It was in Boston that Martin met the lovely Coretta Scott, who was studying voices at the New England Conservatory. At the at the New England Conservatory of Music, like Martin, she was too from the South and had also known the whiplash of prejudice. Before their first date was over, Martin was hinting about marriage, even though They each had a year more schooling ahead of them. As the months passed, Martin's talk of marriage became more pressing. Coretta did not know what to do. She wanted to become a concert singer and had hoped not to marry until her career was safely launched. Martin, however, convinced her otherwise, and they were married on June 18th, 1953. The ceremony was performed by Martin's father in the garden of Coretta's home. By the time the newlyweds had completed their last year of school, they were faced with a very serious decision. Their new Dr. King had offers of teaching jobs in 3 colleges. Also, there were 3 churches, 2 of them in the north, that wanted Dr. King for their passengers. The third church was in the south, in Montgomery, Alabama. Both Dr. King and his wife were tempted to turn their backs on the South, where both had suffered as second class citizens. By accepting one of the offers in the North, they knew that they could lead an easier life. Yet the South, despite its mistreatment of Negroes, was still homes. It was where their roots were, and Martin Coretta wanted to be back with their families and friends. Martin accepted the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Together, the young couple hoped to help in shaping a brighter future for their people. So this is the marriage. This is the marriage on the left. So it says, the ceremony was performed by Martin's father in the garden of Coretta's home. It says, the spark catches. Martin's father had objected to his decision to accept the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He had hoped that Martin would stay in Atlanta as co-pastor of Ebenezer, but he had other reasons too. Reverend King remembered that on one visit of Montgomery, many years Reverend King remembered that on one visit on Montgomery many years before, he and a group of ministers had brought it a trolley. The white conductor had taken their fares at the front end and then ordered them to get off the trolley and board it again at the Negro entrance in the back. Reverend King had refused to do this, demanding his money back. He stood his ground and a heated argument followed. Finally, his friends persuaded him to get off the trolley. Things had not changed much when his son arrived in Montgomery 25 years later. Buses had replaced the trolley cars, but Negroes still had to take their seats in the rear. Dr. King was soon speaking out painfully against such injustice in his Sunday sermons. He had also started talking to the other ministers and to the Negro leaders in the community about Grundy's program of civil disobedience. Why couldn't such a plan work in the Montgomery, he wondered? What happens if Negroes stop riding the buses as a protest? He asked his friend. They thought that such a plan might work someday. Then one day, after Dr. King had been in Montgomery over a year, and there was still only talk among Negroes about doing something to help himself. A middle-aged Negro seamstress, Miss Rosa Parks, did something. After work, she boarded a bus in downtown Montgomery, paid her fare, and took the first seat behind a sign reading "Reserved for White." Reserved for white. Three other Negroes, three other Negroes also sat near her in a white section. As the bus began to fill up with white passengers, the driver ordered the Negroes to stand and make room for them. The other three Negroes promptly gave up their seats. Miss Parker remained in hers. Again, the driver ordered her to stand. She remained in her seat. A policeman was called, and Miss Rosa was arrested and taken in jail. It was Thursday evening, December 1st, 1955. One of the first people to hear of Miss Park's arrest was E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter. He once had been a state president of the National Association. This is reserved for white. So he has been a state president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest Negro civil rights group. Miss Parks had been his secretary. When he was notified of her arrest, he immediately wanted to sign a bond for her release. Miss Parks' arrest troubled Mr. Knoxon deeply. He felt that it was an outrage against the Negro community. Early the next morning, Mr. Knoxon called Dr. King and suggested that Negroes should stop riding the bus as a protest against Mrs. Parks' arrest. Dr. King agreed that the time to boycott the buses had come. That night, a meeting of Negro leaders were held in Dr. King's church. The minister who were present agreed to speak to the congregation on Sunday about the tremendous importance of the refusing to ride the buses. The group also planned to print and distribute 7,000 leaflets notifying the Negro community of the bus boycott. The white community soon learned of the boycott too. The Negro maid was given one of the leaflets, and being unable to read, asked her employer to read it to her. The white woman could hardly believe what she was reading, and how did they rage. She called a newspaper. By Saturday morning, the planned boycott was on page 1. Dr. King and his associates were delighted. A white newspaper was given them for better distribution than they had planned. The leaflets were printed word for word. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or any place Monday, December 5th. If you work, take a cab or share ride or walk. Come to a mass meeting Monday at 7 p.m. At the Hall Street Baptist Church for further instructions. So the bus line, which went past their homes, was used by more Negroes than any other line. It was usually crowded for domestic workers as in early morning. As they watched from a front window, they saw the first bus roll slowly by. It was empty. 15 minutes later, a second bus came by. It was empty. The dirt bus carried only two white passengers. Dr. King dressed hurriedly and rushed out of the house to his car. For more than an hour he cruised around, observing every bus. He counted only 8 Negro passengers. On any normal day, the bus would have been carrying some 17,500 Negroes to and from their job. And from their job. So, walking for freedom. So, Mrs. Parks was fined $10 and court costing for disobeying the city's segregation law, which did not grant Negroes the same rights as whites. Now, for the first time, there was a clear-out test case to challenge the unjust segregation laws. Later that afternoon, at a meeting of boycott leaders, Dr. King was unanimously elected president of a newly formed. Organization. The Montgomery Improvement Association. This group was to set policy and plan strategy for the boycott. Returning home that evening for a few moments before the mass meeting, Dr. King told his wife that he was deeply concerned about the new responsibility that certainly had been thrust upon him. He explained that he would no longer have much time to spend at home with her and with their 2-week-old daughter, Yonder. And he finished in a quiet voice, "It is only fair to warn you that there is an element of danger in all this." Coretta listened calmly to all Martin had to say. Finally, in a reassuring voice, she said, "Whatever you do, you know you have my backing. We'll worry about danger when we're in it," she added, and managed a half smile. At the mass meeting that night, the Hall Street Church was filled to overflowing, and about 3,000 more people. More people were unable to get in. Loudspeakers were set up outside so that they could hear what was being said inside the church. With unusually fervor and spiritual outpouring, the huge crowd lifted its voice in an opening hymn. With one mighty voice came the words, "Onward, Christian soldiers." Then Dr. King rose to speak. and the crowd was silent. The television cameras began to roll. The bus boycott had become news. Love must be a regulating ideal. Dr. King stressed in his clear, strong voice, "Once again, we must hear the words of Jesus echoing across the centuries. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and pray for them that despitefully use you. If you will protect courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, when the history books are written in the future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, they live a great people, a black people who injected a new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. This is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility." The first few days of the boycott gave it added momentum and provided the Negro community with a new sense of pride, dignity, and a spirit of working together. The Negroes walked cheerfully, sometimes in the rain, and very often for great distance. Old men and women walked as well as young children. Some rode mules through the street or drove horse and wagon rigs. Others others rode others rode in one of the 210 Negroes operated taxicabs whose owners had agreed to let passengers ride at bus fare rates. New volunteer carpools formed each day, but they don't ride the buses. Soon it was obvious to the owners of the bus company and to the white community that Negroes were not going to ride the buses unless their terms were their terms met. They wanted only three things: courteous treatment from drivers, sitting on a first come, first served basis, and the employment of Negro bus drivers. The bus company and the city officials would not agree to the Negroes' terms, so the boycott continued. Then the city officials began a get tough policy boycotters. With the boycotters, carpool drivers were stopped and asked to show their license and insurance policies. On the smallest excuse, they were given tickets. Riders waiting to be picked up were threatened with arrest as hitchhikers. Most of the boycotters stood firm. Only a few quit the car pools, fearful that their license might be revoked or their surge canceled. Some quit because they were afraid that they could not remain nonviolent in the face of police abuse. Then one day, Dr. King himself was arrested on a trump-up charge, but he was not to be behind bars for long. News of his arrest spread quickly throughout the Negro community, and everyone began heading towards the jail to see what could be done to help. Soon, such a large crowd of well witches was gathered outside the jail that the jailer began to panic. He was the jailer began to panic. He released Dr. King on his own and personally ushered him out of jail. Before long, more violent methods were used to force the Negroes to end their boycott. Early one night, a bomb was tossed on the porch of Dr. King's home while he was at a mass meeting. Just before the bomb exploded, Coretta grabbed her infant daughter and ran to the rear of the house. Most of the front windows of the King's home were broken and the living room was a shambles, but Coretta and the baby were safe. Luckily, Coretta had heard something heavy drop on the front porch. By the time Dr. King received news of the bombing and arrested at his home, an angry crowd of Negroes had gathered. So at gather around his house. Police weren't able to control them. Many were armed and obviously unwilling to remain nonviolent. If you have any weapons, Dr. King said to them quietly, take them home. If you do not have them, please do not seek to get them. We cannot solve this problem through violence. Remember the words of Jesus. He who lives by the sword shall perish by the sword. We must meet our white brothers' hate with love. Neither bombing, harassment, nor trick stopped the boycott, and after 3 months of a Montgomery grand jury met and concluded, that the boycott was illegal. Then they proceeded to arrest 100 of the boycotters and their leaders. Cheerfully, all of them surrounded and went to jail. Dr. King received word that there was a warrant out for his arrest while he was on a speaking tour in Nashville, Tennessee. He hurried back to Montgomery and, like the others, and like and like and like the others, voluntarily gave him and like the others voluntarily gave himself up. By now, the nation's press had learned of the massive arrests and reporters' television crew swarmed into Montgomery from all over. When March 19th, the time for trial arrived, the press of the world covered the event. Among them were newsmen from France and England and from India. The liberated nation whose leader, Gandhi, had expired, Martin Luther King. After a 4-day trial, Dr. King was found of violating the state's anti-boycott law. The judge then sentenced Dr. King either to pay a fine of $500 or to serve 386 days at hard labor in the county jail. Quickly, a notice of appeal was filed, and Dr. King and the others were released on bond. 2 months later, on May 11th, a hearing of the appeal was held in a federal court before 3 judges. They took 3 weeks to count to a decision, but it was worth waiting for. They decided that the segregation laws governing city buses in Montgomery could not be enforced because they were unconstitutional. But total victory was not yet won. Lawyers for the city of Montgomery now took the case to the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. Once again, Montgomery lost. On November 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court also declared that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. After 381 days of walking for freedom, Montgomery's 5,000 Negroes, for Martin Luther King Jr. as leaders, had won out against injustice. They had stood together as American Negroes had never before stood together, and they had won new dignity for themselves and respect of the world in their victory. We shall overcome. Okay, we shall overcome. From this time forward, there was no turning back for Dr. King. Overnight, he found himself the leader of the awakened people. Plans were made to attain protests all over the South. A new organization was formed. It was called Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Dr. King was elected its president. Other groups also joined the fight for freedom. White-collar students from the from the North joined forces with Negro college students from the South. They banded together and began sit-ins at restaurants and stores which would not serve Negroes. They were met with threats and often with beatings, but they were not stopped and they did not lose their nonviolence. Then the freedom rides began. Groups of whites and Negroes from all over the country boarded buses in the South and sat together in the white section. And they test the bus station restaurants and highways. Restaurants insisted that the Negroes among them had the right to be served in places of public They accommodation. They were carted off to jail by the hundreds. In jail, they went on hunger strikes and sung freedom songs. We shall overcome became the freedom fighter songs. We Shall Overcome became the freedom fighters songs. It was sung on picket lines, at the bus stations, and on protest marches. People joined hands at realize and the lonely at the lone sun fields of the rural south and sing it by the light of the frequent churches as they march to jail. They sing, "We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." Whenever the freedom movement reached a crush, Dr. King was there to give his poem, give his Dr. King was there to give his people courage and spiritual guidance. Older protest groups like the Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People gave their support to the freedom movement. They were joined by newly formed groups like the Congress of Racial Equality and the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The, the, clergy, the clergy of all the faiths joined the movement. White ex ex wait ex let me see ex what
Episcopalian.
White Episcopalian. Okay. So white Episcopalian ministers were jailed for freedom, writing in Jewish and Jewish Bas and for Jewish Baptist and for Jewish Baptist fasted and prayed in the jails of the South. A Catholic bishop insisted that the white schools and his diocese in his
Diocese.
It says that the white schools in his diocese admit Negroes. Dr. King spoke at trials of thousands and at small gatherings in the fields. His growing family saw very little of him, but his wife Coretta stood firm. The Chicago child Martin Luther King III was only a year old when when a mentally ill Negro woman stabbed Dr. King with a paper knife in New York City. He was critical condition for days, while Miss King was carrying Dexter Scott, their third child. Dr. King was serving time in Atlanta jail for leading a protest march. A few days later, after Dr. King gave birth to their youngest daughter, Bernice Albertine, Albertine, Dr. King finished a week of demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama. He led a crowd of 2,500 Negroes straight through police lines and headed downtown. They were arrested at lunch counters and on the streets. But but still, they came rank on rank, dressed in their Sunday best and singing, "We shall overcome." Firehouses were turned on them, and many were drawn flat by the powerful steams of water. Others took their places. All in all, 3,300 Negroes were arrested that week in Bremerton. They were carted off to jail, still singing. Among them was Dr. King. Coretta was worried. Usually, thanks. Coretta was worried. Usually, when Dr. King was jailed, when he was able to get word due to her, but this time he was being held in solitary confinement. Finally, and des- and desperation, she placed a call to President Kennedy to find out if her husband was all right, but she could not reach him. The threat of violence or of sudden death was never far from Coretta's thoughts. Early the following evening, Coretta received a long-distance call. She picked up the phone and let's see. And the operator said shortly, "Will you please get your child off the phone? 2 years. Would you please get your child off the phone?" 2 years old, Dexter had picked up the extension phone downstairs and was busy chatting away. He had no idea that he was interfering in affairs of state. The operating was trying to connect President Kennedy with Mrs. King. He was calling to assure her that her husband was safe, that the FBI was staying by. The Kings did not find it easy to bring up a normal family in the setting of Dr. King's work. The two older children, Yolanda and Dexter, became to ask why their father kept going to jail. They knew that people generally go to jail for doing wrong. Coretta assured them that their father went to jail to help people. Still, other children teased them about it, and there were hard, moments. Dr. King always tried. Dr. King always tried to spend as many weekends as possible with his family, and and he did. He's his best never to miss a holiday. And he did. And his best never to miss a holiday at home. But the freedom movement demanded more and more of his time. Listen, but the freedom movement demanded more and more of his time, and more of his time. One year, he traveled 275,000 miles and made 350 speeches. The freedom rides, the sittings, and the protest marches kept going straight. Students tramped the red dirt roads of Georgia and swamplands of Mississippi, encouraging Negroes to register and vote. The surge towards freedom was answered by the burning of four Negro churches in Georgia. A white mailman, William Moore, walking the roads as a long freedom watcher, was murdered in Alabama. Medgar Evers, a Negro leader, was shot to death on his own front porch in the dead of night in Mississippi, and there were other martyrs. It was time of trouble and terror, and a time of truth and trump true. I have a dream. In August 20 in August 28th, 1963, a huge civil rights demonstration, the March on Washington, was held. It was the largest crowd ever together in Washington, D.C., over 250,000 strong. Young and old, Negro and white, gentle and Drew, housewife, sharecroppers, singer, servants, and statesmen gather on the slope of the Washington Monument. Shoulders to shoulder, they march on the Lincoln Memorial. They had poured into Washington by the busload. They had jammed the weights. They had jammed. They had jammed the waiting room of hundreds of small railway stations. Seats on planes were not to be found, and carpools inched forward, bumper to bumper, on the roads that led into Washington from the north, south, east, and west. Many came from overseas too. So, diplomats from the new African nation and press representatively were first representative from the capitals of Europe. Week before the great day, an 82-year-old man left Daytonocchio for the march on a silver bicycle. A civil rights worker made the trip from Chicago to Washington on a roller skate. The military police were out in full force, too. Businessmen and officials feared that violence might break out in such a huge crowd, but there was no violence. The crowd had learned the lesson. The crowd had learned the lesson. The crowd had learned the lessons of Martin Luther King too well. He stood before, dwarfed by the brooding statue of Abraham Lincoln, and this is the whole crowd here. Abraham and he said, "I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. We were able to speed up that day when all of the God's children, join in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The March on Washington gave the Civil Rights Movement new importance, Dr. King and other Negro leaders were asked to help draft a bill that would give the Negro equal rights. Time Machines chose Dr. King as the Man of the Year and used his picture on its cover. He was given several honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Laws from Yale University. Officials who had seen the tremendous show of strength that the march expressed began to take an interest in the Civil Rights Bill that President Kennedy has proposed. But the days of grief were not yet over. On Sunday morning, September 15th, a Negro church which had been used for civil rights meetings was bombed. 4 little girls were killed as they recited their Sunday school lessons. Later that day, 2 teenage Negro boys were shot and killed from ambushed. People of goodwill everywhere were deeply shocked by the murders of these innocent children. Demands for a strong civil rights bill came from all sides. It was feared that the Negroes' self-control might snap if such a bill was not soon made laws. Before he was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy presented a civil rights bill on Congress. The bill was passed by the House of Representatives but was held up by the Senate for many months. It was finally passed. It was finally passed. It was finally passed by the members of the Senate and signed by President Johnson July 2nd, 1964. With the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, the American Negro at last had his foot on the road towards freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. Stated his statement. Martin Luther King Jr. stated his people's new position when he finished a speech saying, "I say good night to you" by quoting an old Negro slave preacher who said, "We ain't what we ought to be, and we ain't what we want to be, and we ain't what we're going to be. But thank God, and we ain't what we was." The price is one. On October 14th, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. took his place among the great men of all lands who have fought for the cause of peace. On that day, it was announced that the young Negro leader had won the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize, which was the first awarded in 1901, was named in honor of its donor, Alfred Bernhard Nobel, the Swedish chemist who invented dynamite. The Peace Prize is one of the 5 Nobel Prizes which are given each year that worthy recipients can be found. It is awarded without discrimination, without distinction of nationality. Besides the Peace Prize, there are 3 Nobel Prizes given for enemies in the fields of chemistry, medicine, and physics. Physics. A fourth prize is awarded to the author of literary works of true idealism. At 35, Dr. King was the youngest person ever to win an award. and the second American Negro. The first was Dr. Ralph J. Buch, who won the Peace Prize for his work as the United Nations Undersecretary. The prize carries a cash award of $54,000, which Dr. King donated to the civil rights movements. The Nobel Medical Medal and diploma were presented to Dr. King in Oslo, Norway on December 10, 1964 by Gunnar John, the chairman of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. The ceremony took place on the anniversary of Dr. Nobel's death in 1896. Dr. King arriving also on a special chartered flight. With him were his wife, his father and mother, his brother and sister, and many of the civil rights leaders who had fought side by side with him for so long. Their memories of the long years of struggles were too plain to see as they stood in the great hall of Oslo University. With pride, they watched a distinguished audience of the world dignitaries, including King, audience, this including King Olavi of Norway, rise in a standing ovation for the simple Irish minister from Atlanta. In his presentation speech, Dr. John described Dr. King as an undaunted champion of peace, the first person in the Western world to have showing us that a struggle can be waged without violence. He spoke of Dr. King as one who has suffered his faith, been imprisoned on many occasions, whose home has been subjected to bomb attacks, whose life and those of his family have been threatened, and whose netherest has never faltered. Dr. King's rich, compelling voice easily filled the huge hall as he acknowledged the award, saying, I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace as at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States of America are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I accept this award in behalf of a civil rights movement in which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice. I come as a trustee, for in the depth of my heart, I am aware that this prize is prize is much more than an honor to me personally. You honor the ground crew, without whose labor and sacrifices the jet flight to freedom could never have left the earth. Many of these people would never make the headline, and their names would not appear in Who's Who. Yet, when the years have rolled past and the blazing light of truth is focused on this marvelous age in which we live, men and women will women will know, and children will be taught that we have a finer land, a better people, a more noble civilization, because these humble children of God were willing to suffer for righteousness' sake. Free at last. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Memphis, Tennessee on April 3rd, 1968, he was welcomed by a crowd of over 2,000 supporters. Dr. King had been invited to Memphis to lead a march on behalf of the city's garbage workers who were striking for higher wages. The strike had become a civil rights cause since more than 90% of the workers were Negroes. On an early trip to Memphis, Dr. King had led a march on behalf of the strikers that ended in violence. One person it is one person was killed and many were injured, and there were over 200 arrests. The violence created by some young black nationalist activists depressed Dr. King, for it was the first time in his civil rights career that violence had erupted. This king of outbreak suddenly threatened his whole philosophy of violence. He was faced with a terrible decision. Should he return to Memphis and try to conduct another nonviolent march or yield to the possibilities of further violence? This period of indecision plagued Dr. King for several days. His first thought was to get out of Memphis and never return. But then he said, "This is no time to quit. Nothing could be more tragic than to stop at this point." He went back to Atlanta, gathered his SCLC staff together, and made plans of strategy to lead a peaceful, nonviolent march through the street of Memphis to support the garage workers' strike. And so it was that on Wednesday, April 3rd, he returned to Muppets to face the supreme test of his therapy of nonviolence. All day on Thursday, April 4th, Dr. King met with his staff in room 306 of the Negro-owned and operated Lorraine Motel in Memphis. At the end of this trying day, Dr. King dressed for dinner and stepped out on the balcony of his meadow about 6 p.m. to join his staff, many of who had already begun to leave for the home of the Reverend Giles, their dinner host. Dr. King had looked forward to the dinner, anticipating the period of relaxation before going to the evening mass meeting. Dressed in his usual public attire, black suit, tie, and white shirt, Dr. King leaned over the iron rail of the balcony and chatted with his staff idols who were standing below in the courtyard of the motel waiting for him. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Some said it sounded like a stick of dynamite. Another witness reported it sounded like a firecracker. Another threw it was an automobile accident, and still others says it had the sound of a bomb. The sharp sound was unusual and unexpected. The Reverend left. Alternatively, Dr. King's longtime friends and Joe's association rushed over out of room 306 to investigate the noise and saw the fallen king stretched out on the concrete floor upnatedly knelt down beside him and tried to speak to him, but the flame prophetic speaker was still speechless. An ambulance was summoned by the police and arrived about 15 minutes later at 7:05 p.m. at Street. Joseph Hospital, an assisted hospital administrator, called together King's tense and nervous staff and read a brief but concise statement. It says 7 p.m. Dr. Martin Luther King expired in the emergency room of a gunshot wound in the neck. Thursday, April 4th, became a black date soon to be recorded in the history as the day of the voice of nonviolence was silenced by an act of violence. Dr. King, the famous American citizen who won the 1964 Nobel Prize for consistently asserting the principle of nonviolence, was gunned down by the assassin who with a single bullet, asserting his principle of violence. The peaceful warrior was gone, and with him peace and tranquility in our cities. Alright, so in our cities, violence erupted in the nation's capital, and almost simultaneously, civil disorder broke out in 46 cities. The senseless murder of this famed American ignited an emotional fire across the country. Angry Negroes spilled into the streets of numerous cities, reacting against the assassination of Dr. King, their fallen leader. Stores were burned, cars overturned, windows smashed, rocks thrown, and people were killed and injured. Within a week, the riots brought on by the death of Dr. King had claimed 39 lives. The assassination had provoked the kinds of emotions that produce an antithesis to his life, violence and death. The President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, spoke to Americans on radio and television and said, "We have been saddened by the assassination of Dr. King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence." He later issued a proclamation. I, Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States, do call upon all Americans to observe next Sunday, the 7th of April, as the Day of Nation all morning throughout the United States. I direct that until instrument of the flag of the United States shall be flowing at half-staff on all buildings, grounds, and naval vessels of the federal government of the District of Columbia and throughout the United States and its territories and possessions. Dr. King's body went on public view Saturday afternoon, April 6th, in the chapel of Spelman College, a part of the Atlantic University system, where Dr. King had gone to college and remained there until Monday afternoon, when it was removed and carried to Ebenezer Baptist Church. Co-pastored by the father-son team of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Jr., There it remained until the funeral service, which were held Tuesday morning, April 9th. More than 50,000 mourners passed by, some quietly, others sobbing. Some cried aloud, and others were nearly collapsed. Many children passed by Dr. King's body. Some were so little that they had to be lifted by their parents to see the body and the glass-covered coffin. In the wake of Dr. King's death, the overwhelming public response was one of the grief and regret. Tributes came in from everywhere. Tributes come in from everywhere. They come from black and white, rich and poor, from home and abroad, from the young and the old. His children received numerous letters of sympathy and many invitations to spend their vacations with other children. Once, one little boy wrote, "I'm sorry, I feel so sorry that you lost your daddy. I will be glad to share mine with you." With preparation for the final rites were being completed in Atlanta, dignitaries and plain people were streaming into the city by the thousands. People came from everywhere: ministers from St. Louis, brick masons from Detroit, garbage workers from Muppets, congressmen from Washington, movie stars from Hollywood, friends from foreign lands, and thousands of others. The public service was held on the campus of Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King received his undergraduate degree and was regarded as the most understanding alumnus of the institution. There were so many people on the campus, and the crowd was so crushing. That the service had to be shortened. A number of people became ill, and several fainted. After the service, the ride to the graveside began. The Reverend Ralph Alpenately officiated at the final service and said, "The ceremony is too small for his spirit, but we commit his body to the ground." Mrs. King sat still and strung as she listened and watched. The children had tears in their eyes. They joined their mother in putting their hands on the coffin before it was rolled into the Georgia mobile crypt. Some were very simple words formed in the epitaph on a crypt. There were words from an old slave song that Dr. King often used to end his speeches. They probably would be his words now if he speak them. Free at last. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. So, a short biology of books on Negroes and the Civil Rights Movement, starting with the easiest ones. The first book of Negroes. Let's see. Is that it? Let's see if I can put this song on. We shall overcome. let's see. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
There's a little song within our breast, with words of hope and love. The melody blends as we join hands with
We shall overcome. So it says, we are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We walk hands in hands. We walk hands in hands, and we walk hands in head someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. This song, as we know it today, was composed by Miss Zebula Horton at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. So, let's see. This, or maybe there's some other books. Huh? So, the following is a Dr. Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, which was made at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on the occasion of the Civil Rights March, Washington, on August 28, 1963. I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King. 50 years ago, a great American in whose sympathetic shadows we stand signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of a Negro is still sadly crumbled by the maniacal of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negroes live in a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of a material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American charities and finds himself in exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize an appealing condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American wished to for her. for her. This note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuits scared obligation. America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back market and insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vitals of opportunity of this nation. So we have to come to cash this check, a check that would give us upon demand the riches of freedom. And the Secretary of Justice, we have also come to his hallowed spot to remind America and the finest urgency of now. This is no time to engage in a luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate vial of segregation to sunlit path of racial justice. Now it is time to open the doors of opportunity of all God's children. Now it is the time to lift our nations from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. It will be the fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the movement and to underestimate the determination of the Negro. This swelling summer of the Negro literament, this content will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1996 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off the steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to a business as usual. There will be a neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted in his citizen rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm dare's hope, which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful peace and a rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of the bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggles on the highest plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny and their and with their freedom is in electricity bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. As we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We cannot be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the figure of travel, cannot gain luggage in the middles of the highway and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until the justice rolls down like a waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of percussions and straggled by the winds of police brutally. You have been the veterans of creative sovereign. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering to redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and the ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be charged. Somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, and that despite of the difficulties and the frustrations and the movements, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out in the true meanings of its creed. We hold those truth and to be self-evident that all men are created equally. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia and the sons of former slave and the son of former slave owner will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state, swelling with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into oases of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama, whose governor lips are presently dripping with the words of imposition and notification, will be transferred into a situation where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalt, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough piece and will be plain, and crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and the flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith with which I return to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountains of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the genuine discord of our nation into the beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together. or to stand for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This would be the day when all of the God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning, my country to my country till these sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my father died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. And if America is to be great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening and Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curved Texas peaks from California. But not only that, let freedom from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountains of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring, when we let it ring, from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we would not be able to speed up that day when all of its God's children, black man and white man, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty. We are free at last. We are free at last. So afterwards, so in 1963, the Congress of the United States set up a federal holiday commemorating the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Each year, the third Monday in January will be set aside to honor Dr. King and to remember how his leadership helped to change the life of millions of Americans. The only other American with a federal holiday in his honor is George Washington. At the ceremony for the signing of the bill establishing the holiday, President Ronald Reagan said that Dr. King's life symbolized what was right about America. What was the noblest and best? Mrs. King urged that when remembering Dr. King, we should all make ourselves worthy to carry on his dream. So, about the author and illustrator. About the author and an illustrator. Ed Clayton was well-known editor, author, and reporter. Born in Louisville, Kentucky, he went to Kentucky State College, where he was class president and edited the school paper. Mr. Clayton worked on special writing assignments for Life and contributed feature articles to the Associated Press, United Press International, and the Associated Negro Press. He also served as an editor with Jet Ebony and Negro Digest. A. Clayton, until his death in 1966, was an associate of Dr. King's at the South Christian Leadership Conference. Dave Hodges is a freelance commercial artist and has worked for leading advertising agencies and book publishers. Born in Brooklyn, he attended the Leonardo da Vinci School of Fine Arts and the Art Students League. Mr. Hodges, who is married and has a grown daughter, Donna Marie, live in St. Albans, New York. And this is the end of the book. This is the end of the book. So, if any of you want to read this book, you can get it from Amazon or the library. So, like Martin Luther King made a big change. So, I was so happy for that. So at least they don't have to go through that anymore. But at least now, white people and black people will be able to be together. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Give a like, subscribe. If you have any questions about this book, you can comment. You can comment on it. So I'll see you in my next video. Have a good night, everyone.